Cedar Village. I'm very excited to have, I'll just call you first time guest. I'm happy to have this chat with Austin Reid. Hello, Austin.
Hello, Rabbi Drew. Thank you for talking to me this evening.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So I heard about you through reading an article in the Columbus Jewish News that you have been doing some research on small town Jewish communities in the great state of Ohio, right?
Yeah,
Right. Awesome. So right off the bat, which communities, which towns?
yeah. So some really good work has been done before me, particularly by a professor who used to teach at University of Kentucky named Amy Hill Shavitz. She focused most of her work right along the Ohio River, but really hasn't gone too far north of the river. So I have been trying to highlight communities that were left out of her book, particularly communities near where I grew up, Lancaster, Ohio, which is in the southeastern part of the state. So I've touched on Zanesville, Lancaster, Chillicothe, and Athens County are some of the places I've written about.
Wow, wow. And so we have residents here. Obviously, we're in Ohio, and maybe most of the people are from Ohio originally. I've met people from Youngstown, Toledo, Dayton. So people, it's not just all from the southwestern part of the state. People have come from all, different parts. I don't want to say all parts because it doesn't sound like the Southeast is well represented from Ohio in my facility. A little quick background on you. So you are currently a grad student, right, at Cornell
Yes.
University? Right. And you mentioned you're originally from Lancaster, Ohio. Is it Lancaster or Lancaster?
It's a funny story there. The locals will say Lancaster. Most other folks in the United States say Lancaster. So whenever I'm not in my hometown, I say Lancaster to avoid the funny looks.
I guess that's one way of knowing who's a local and not when you're in Lancaster, right?
Yep.
What funny looks do people give you when you say Lancaster?
Oh, I live in New York right now, so if I say Lancaster, they're like, what? Do you mean Lancaster? Or they don't know what I'm trying to say. So
Yeah.
I've gotten in the habit of saying it the more Pennsylvanian way.
Right. All right. So you spent undergrad at Capital University in the capital city of our great state. So how'd you get to, and what is it that you're studying as a grad student right now at Cornell?
Yeah, so at Cornell, I'm studying public administration and focusing on public and nonprofit management. I've spent my professional experiences to date working for either government relations agencies in Columbus or in Jewish nonprofit organizations, particularly Hillel. So this program ties more into those experiences. In undergrad, I studied political science and history. And the history program is how I got my first intro into Jewish history in Ohio. That's where I wrote my first paper when I was a student at Capital.
Very neat. So you have some Hillel background up in Ithaca, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And
I worked for 2 years with Hillel at Ithaca College.
great. And you also mentioned to me, which I didn't know, is you issued press releases for which city?
Back in 2016, I worked in Tel Aviv in the mayor's office, and that was my first introduction to media and press releases. And so I was in Tel Aviv for a while writing.
How was that working for the mayor's office of Tel Aviv?
It was a very nice office. We had staff from all around the world. We had someone from Portland, Oregon, someone from Buenos Aires, someone from Paris, and you can really see the many different immigrant groups that have continued to come to Israel. It's not just a historic immigration there, it's still ongoing, and I really did see that in the office. It was a diverse place.
That sounds really neat. Let's dive into the topic of small town Jewish communities here in Ohio. How did you get interested in the research into this project, and where did you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I grew up in Lancaster, and growing up in Lancaster, there were still some residual traces of a historic Jewish presence. And my elementary and middle school was located downtown, and we had a war memorial there that had a small Magen David etched onto it. And I remember being very little, even then wondering, like, why is this symbol here? It's on a memorial. There has to be some reason why this is here. But there weren't very many Jewish families in Lancaster when I was young. There was also near my school the old synagogue building, and it had been converted into a private home after the congregation closed in 1993. And through the years, I would see the building kind of becoming a little bit more and more unkempt and disheveled looking. I think the owners weren't able to like properly take care of it. And I would wonder why the congregation closed and who the people were that once prayed there. When I came to university, my history program would end in a capstone project where we had to research an independent topic. And that's when I decided this was a real opportunity to dive in and learn the stories behind the synagogue at my hometown that had closed a few years before I was born. And I also found out we had a Jewish serviceman named Victor Epstein who did die during World War II. And that is at least one of the names behind the Star of David on the War Memorial. There might be, he's the only one I found from Lancaster who died in combat. There were other Jewish service people from Lancaster, but I suspect he might be why that's there.
Any surprising finds during the course of the research into Lancaster or Lancaster?
Yeah, I think one thing that I remember at the time surprised other folks in the Jewish community when the synagogue, which was called B'nai Israel, Children of Israel, opened in Lancaster around 1927. Both Reform and Orthodox rabbis came to speak at the dedication service, which in the 1920s, that was a statement of interdenominational collaboration that really didn't happen as much as it does today, to have both Reform and Orthodox rabbis speaking at the same event. And also a statement that Lancaster's Jewish community, these rabbis came down from Columbus, while modest in size, had the influence that this was a real event. And many Jews from surrounding towns came to the dedication.
Wow, it was a sight to see, I guess. It was the event.
Yeah,
The event
about 250 people came.
Wow.
So, yeah, and the ladies made dinner for everyone, so I was impressed by that too, that I'm sure the ladies auxiliary probably didn't have more than a few dozen members, and all of a sudden there's a couple hundred guests. And I would find that in many places, the role of the ladies auxiliaries in these small synagogues was quite important. They did a lot to keep these buildings operational and fundraise, provide for guests, and it's really amazing.
What did you find? You mentioned that the synagogue eventually closed in 1993. I imagine that the community must have dwindled in certainly the 80s, maybe also in the 1970s. What ultimately caused people to, I guess, leave and never come back? I imagine the middle of the century probably was at its heyday, right? At its most robust, and then probably by the 70s, 80s, people petered out, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for several of the small towns I've looked at, their communities peak somewhere between the early 1940s and early 60s. In Lancaster, we saw kind of post-industrialization, the glass factories diminish their production. The shoe industry in Lancaster, which was quite big, outsourced. We would see in other towns like Zanesville that also had their specific products that were made in the town, also being outsourced. So the Jewish migration out of these towns mirrored a much larger population outflow. So most of these towns now overall have much smaller populations than they did in the middle of the century. Lancaster is a bit of an exception because Columbus has grown so much. A lot of people are commuting to Columbus, and it's becoming a bedroom community. But many of these towns, Zanesville, Chillicothe. Just in general, the populations have declined.
Was it largely because they were manufacturing, they were doing industry, and then they slowly started outsourcing them and no longer doing that manufacturing in Ohio?
Yeah, once the jobs left, especially these what were good paying jobs, families moved away, and also particularly young children, they would go off to university and not come back. So we would really see that in many of these Jewish communities. They were founded by immigrants, and maybe one generation would stay in the city, but once students started going to university, they stayed away.
Mm. Yeah. Because there really just wasn't much for them. It sounds like not only economically, but probably also socially as well.
Yeah, the economics definitely played a role. I would say it seems like for especially for Jewish females, finding a match when I would say the largest communities here were never numbered more than 100 people out of the whole entire town. So there wasn't a lot of matching prospects. It seems like for men, it was probably more common that they could bring their bride back to the town and start a family, but women in particular usually moved out.
Mm-hmm. So you meant, can we just do the cities again? So which town or towns I should really say. So you mentioned obviously Lancaster, Chillicothe, Zanesville. Which other towns came up?
Yeah, there's one paper I wrote which I lump as Athens County. Athens County is interesting in that it still has a vibrant Jewish community down in Athens, Ohio, significantly tied to Ohio University, keeping that one vibrant. But other small coal mining towns like Gloucester, the Plains, also had Jewish families. They never quite had enough usually to have their own synagogues. They would probably go to Athens for services. But all those towns did have small Jewish presences around the turn of the 20th century.
Wow. But as you mentioned, that was more immigrants, like first generations coming in, and then things changed, right?
Yeah. We would see, particularly in the 1840s, 1850s, probably up to the 1880s, most of the Jewish immigrants coming to this part of Ohio were from German-speaking regions of Europe. We see a lot of people from Alsace-Lorraine and Eastern France, long-time part of Germany, Austria. And then by the 1880s, we see the immigrant pattern change, where most of the immigrants are coming from Eastern Europe, parts of the Russian Empire and Hungary. Some of the very early families in southeastern Ohio get more interesting, though. We found one family in Chillicothe that is descendants of Sephardic Jews who came to the United States in the 1700s and were closely connected to President Jefferson. So one of their descendants found his way to Chillicothe and was there by the 1820s.
Wow. So now I feel like we just switched centuries from the 20th to the 19th. So if I can change up the century, so 19th century, was it a lot more spread out, a lot more diverse as far as little pockets of Jewish population in Ohio?
I would say so. This is a theory that I haven't quite proven yet, but it seems that the economic factors at that time motivated more people to move to smaller towns. There wasn't, places like Columbus still hadn't developed quite as much, so there was really, Circleville, Ohio, or Chillicothe, Ohio, was almost as economically vibrant as Columbus at the time. So you had much more people spreading out. Even Cleveland didn't really take off until I think the late 1800s. So much of these towns looked very much the same.
So Cincinnati probably was leading the way as far as a big city.
Yes.
In the 19th, I should say in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep, that's correct. Yeah, Cincinnati was definitely the Ohio's and one of the Midwest's largest economic centers, but most of the interior of the state was still sparsely populated.
Hmm. So then I guess, so those were a lot of German immigrants in the 19th century. And then we have ultimately the Eastern Europeans, end of the 19th and then on into the early 20th century, correct? That really
Mm-hmm.
drove Jewish population, or certainly Jewish population growth in the state of Ohio, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and a lot of that goes along with these small towns.
Yeah. It's estimated, this is a national number, but probably around 1870, the U.S. population for Jews was probably no more than 250,000 across the whole country. And then we saw by the 1920s, it's several million. So it was really this immigration from Eastern Europe many times multiplied the Jewish community. And similar to the German immigrants, though, there would be maybe someone's cousin. You would see chains of families come. So maybe like once one family member somehow found their way to a small town, you would commonly see maybe not too many years later, their brother would bring their family or cousin. So these family chains would help grow these communities.
Very neat. Very neat. So so you started off with Lancaster, obviously for you, very important, very personal, because that's where you grew up. How did you then decide to study other towns in their Jewish populations?
Yeah. When I was reading about Lancaster, I would find evidence of families in other towns. There would be Jewish families from fairly far away, sometimes 50 miles away, who would come to Lancaster to attend high holiday services or have their children's bar mitzvah. So it kind of tipped me off that in some of these small towns, you still had Jewish families. Much in the same way I wanted current residents of Lancaster to remember the Jewish community in town. I hope to have other residents in other parts of southeastern Ohio also remember their Jewish communities. And it started a chain following the families. If some families are from Athens, I try to figure out who else was there, and it's a puzzle that kind of all comes together.
Yeah. Any surprises in studying any of those other towns and their Jewish populations, or everything?
Yeah,
Oh yeah, go for it.
You come across some really incredible stories. Occasionally, there is a man named Samuel Eichenbaum who lived in a very small village in Perry County, which even today is one of Ohio's most rural counties. That's there's not even a city in the county. I think it's all officially towns or villages.
Where is
he was
that?
an immigrant.
Where is that?
I would say it's about 60 minutes east of Columbus. In the closest city is probably Lancaster, but it's definitely, people would be surprised that there was ever any Jewish presence there. It's so off the beaten path.
Okay.
But even that town, this gentleman named Samuel, he was the mayor for 6 terms, the president of the school board, responsible for building Perry County's, at least under his administration, the first paved roads and waterworks in the city. So it's a city, and his descendants lived in Corning until I would say the 1970s. He came in the 1880s. So you say like that's a town that many folks would say doesn't have a place in the Ohio Jewish experience, but I would say it arguably does. There hasn't been, even in the whole state, that many Jewish mayors, and Samuel was practically running this town for about 20 years as mayor and president of the school board. And there's also a story in Zanesville where this family named Moses and Rosa Clafter came to Zanesville from Hungary worked as peddlers, selling just various materials all around the county, going door to door. And they moved to Cleveland, and their grandson becomes a United States senator. So you see, I think that's something that's been very inspiring for me, is seeing several examples of, I guess might call the American dream. These families come to the United States with very little. They're fleeing persecution in Europe, many of them from Eastern Europe. And then you see their grandchildren go on to do things I'm sure they never imagined. Sure, Moses coming to the United States did not think his grandchild would be in Congress.
Cool. That's very neat. It's very neat, especially some of those more, really abstruse, just out of the way places. Yeah, that's really neat. Where have you shared this research, or is it was it just for school purposes, or have you shared them more broadly?
Yeah. So I try to partner with local historical societies in every community I'm researching. Most of the time, these towns do not have any organized record of the Jewish history. They might have records of some individual Jewish families, but only rarely has it been organized. So every historical society has copies of their town's paper for use by local researchers and genealogists. Some places, like in Athens, have made little books out of it that you can find at their history centers. The Columbus Jewish Historical Society has also been a real supporter of my work and mentor for me since I started this project. So some of the papers, and eventually all of them, will be digitized or made available on the website that they have. Hebrew Union College's archives has some of the papers, and I'll be talking to Cleveland's Jewish archives very soon to include the papers there as well.
Very neat.
One other topic that surprised me while doing this research is the level of interfaith tolerance in a lot of these small communities. It's something many people would not expect. Even as far back as the 1850s, churches were inviting rabbis to come and give lectures and sermons to non-Jewish audiences. And we'll see that continue all the way basically until today. But rabbis being asked to come give high school commencement addresses, speak to groups like Rotary at churches. We also see some very early examples of tolerance for the Jewish community, churches that would lend out their spaces for high holiday services. That happened in Zanesville in the early 1900s before a synagogue could be built for the community. And that's been really good for me to hear and learn about, is the rich history of interfaith tolerance in a lot of these places.
That's great. I mean, that probably, when thinking about it, probably helped facilitate, continued Jewish population in those places. That if there were, so much antagonism to the Jewish community there, they probably would have left, right?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the big important reasons why small town Jewish history matters, I feel, is it played a large role in making Judaism a mainstream religion in the United States, that we would see groups that used to exist, like the Association of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, that was quite active until the 80s nationally. I think now it's renamed to something else, but why was it those big three religions that were collaborating so much on a national level? I think small town Jewish life and the fact that so many Americans had an opportunity to engage with Jewish people. And I do wonder what it means sometimes for the Jewish future in this country, that many places, Americans do not have the opportunity to know Jewish people anymore. Where I grew up in Southeastern Ohio, there's definitely many people who would say they've never met a Jewish person, or don't know any Jewish people on a meaningful level. So that's something that's interesting. I think it's being lost when these communities fade.
It's really interesting. I mean, a lot of it sounds like it was driven by economic realities, and that's where we're at now. Especially since, as the Jewish population, certainly when I think of even just Ohio, it tends to clump around, obviously, the three C's: Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, as well as Toledo, Youngstown, Dayton. But I imagine there's probably still some other pockets of Jewish communities. But as you mentioned, these smaller town Jewish communities that were in the 19th and early 20th century really aren't around as much anymore, if at all. Right. So there's less opportunity for interaction between Gentiles to even just meet a Jew, let alone have, as you mentioned, a meaningful relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a national trend, particularly in the Midwest and American South, that so many of these historic Jewish communities that are often 150 plus years old are finally fading. I would say within the last 15 years, there's been several small town synagogue closures in Ohio. And now I can only think of maybe less than 5 places under 40,000 people that have a synagogue. There aren't too many places in Ohio that still have congregations active that are small towns.
Wow. Austin, thank you so much. This was very insightful and really fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Rabbi Drew.
Absolutely. All right.